Hi, I'm Jonathan Kaplan from the Department of Middle Eastern Studies, and these are my office hours on the Hebrew Bible and early Judaism. So that's a great question. We actually don't know who compiled the Hebrew Bible. That's the biggest challenge that faces scholarship, is figuring out really who those people are. We know from comparative evidence from the ancient Near East that the most likely candidate are a group of people we call scribes. And scribes in the ancient world did things like keep transaction receipts, write contracts, write annals of the kings, keep all sorts of records for the temple and the palace. And we likely suspect, because of the way they kept collections of important works, that the best candidate for who compiled the Hebrew Bible were scribes. They're the ones with access to the materials, they're the ones with literacy and the capacity to write these things. We also know from the ancient world that these scribes oftentimes, in their copying, also expanded and elaborated and clarified the meaning of the works which they were transcribing. And so the scribes likely had a role in helping to expand and codify what became the Bible that we have today. Now, the question of when this process occurred or how did they do it, that's a super challenging one as well. We understand the process of the compilation of the Hebrew Bible is something which took place over more than a millennium. So the earliest parts of the Hebrew Bible we can date to roughly the 12th century BCE. And the newest parts of the Bible, the most recently written parts, are to the 2nd century BCE. So there's a long process of scribal transmission, scribal collection, or to use a word which folks have liked to use in the last decade, curation of materials, and bringing those together into the form we have today took a really, really long time. So the Torah are the first 5 books of any Bible you're going to look at, whether Jewish or Christian. And it tells the narrative from the creation of the world until Israel's exodus from Egypt and their eventual settlement in the land of Canaan. This collection of books, when it's in this final form, tells a relatively continuous narrative, although scholars will debate that a little more closely. This book, or collection of 5 books, as they're put together, eventually receives the name Torah. Torah is the word in Hebrew for teaching, one of the words for teaching, and in fact is used in the book of Deuteronomy, the last of the 5 books, to describe Moses' teaching, the Torah to Moshe, in the book of Deuteronomy. After the 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are put together as a collection, the word Torah begins to be applied to the whole of the book. We understand this process as being rather early in the stages of the development of what eventually becomes our Bible, viewing this work as one coherent narrative and thus one collection of works within the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, or known oftentimes in Christian Bibles as the Pentateuch, or the 5 books. In short answer, the answer to that question is no. Not everything in the Bible is meant to be taken literally. We, in academic biblical scholarship, have known for a long time that genre is essential to interpreting a text. Texts mean different things depending upon the literary form that they have. So a legal text has the literary form of a law and therefore should be interpreted as a law. A narrative has the literary form of a narrative and should be interpreted using the conventions of narrative. Likewise, a poem has the literary conventions of a poem, and we should think about the ways that poems produce meaning as we interpret them. The challenge, however, is sometimes some genres are a little bit hard to figure out, or literary strategies are hard to discern. Things like sarcasm or hyperbole, super, super hard. Oftentimes when we encounter literature in the Bible, sometimes it's hard for us to understand what's going on or recognize what it's truly trying to communicate, because it's difficult for us to understand or discern what the tone of the literature is and the specific literary forms which it's using. But that's really the challenge which we take up in biblical scholarship, and is something we're continually trying to deepen our understanding of as we work through these important texts of ancient Israel. Prophets and judges and also priests are different roles that people played in ancient Israelite and ancient Jewish society. It's very hard for us to think about these roles because we oftentimes have our modern understandings of what they mean. And actually, in the time of ancient Israel, oftentimes there would be overlap between these roles depending upon who were in them. So when judges first started out in the early period of Israel's history, they functioned as kind of like local, non-dynastic, charismatic leaders. People who might rise to power and after they died, fade out, and another person would arise and become the judge or local ruler. We still kind of preserve that meaning of judge here in Texas because we have county judges who sit in the county commissioner's court and administer the affairs of the county. And that's oftentimes how judges in antiquity in ancient Israel functioned, as they were like local rulers who ruled for a time and then passed the mantle on to someone else. Later on in Israel's history, judges became something like we understand judges today, people who would sit in court and would render legal verdicts and legal judgments. Prophets, as we often know, are people in antiquity in ancient Israel who were people who disclosed God's will in the broadest sense of it, or communicated some form of divine message to the people. Sometimes there'll be overlap between a prophet and a judge, and sometimes even a priest, in the actual figure. So probably the most famous example of this is the prophet Samuel, who ruled as a judge, grew up in a temple and was probably some sort of temple official, and also eventually became known as the prophet Samuel, and went on to not only have rulership over part of ancient Israel, but eventually anointed the first kings of Israel, Saul, followed by his successor, David. The Song of Songs is a super strange text. Most people, when they encounter it today, will look at it and read it as a kind of erotic love poetry about two young adults who are really interested and in love with one another and chase each other through the vales and vineyards and streets in and around Jerusalem. The text is very, very erotic if one reads it with attention to those details. And so it looks super strange to our modern imagination when we find that text in the midst of a bunch of texts we consider to be religious, because religion isn't supposed to be about eroticism or sex. The challenge is, however, that in the ancient world, no one ever read the Song of Songs as a work of erotic love poetry. In fact, the only way they read it is a meditation, a metaphorical meditation on the relationship between God, the God of Israel, and his people, or in the case in later Christian tradition of the relationship between Christ and the church. So we have a strange sort of problem for us as modern readers. And the problem, I would say, isn't with the text itself, because we do have other passages in the Hebrew Bible which read and interpret and think about the relationship of God and Israel in the sort of metaphor of a relationship between a husband and a wife, or other types of male-female relationships. That's not the problem. The problem is actually, I think, with us and our expectations that we bring to religious texts. Dream interpretation is a form of divination in the ancient world. Divination is a way of understanding what's going on between the divine realm and the human realm, or the way the divine is interacting with the human. One other way to think about it is a divination is a form of understanding what God desires in the world, or how things will proceed. Dream interpretation is one form of that practice of divination, and it requires specialists. When you have a dream of some sort, a dream which has a divinatory character, those dreams require someone to interpret them. So when we think about Joseph and Daniel, they're not primarily dreamers, they're primarily dream interpreters. And that's actually the role that they play in the court of Pharaoh, in the case of Joseph, and in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, the great Neo-Babylonian monarch that we see in the book of Daniel. And in fact, they rise to power and prominence in those societies by virtue of their skill as dream interpreters, people who can help guide the state by interpreting properly what the future holds for those respective empires. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of the fragments of about 900 different manuscripts that were discovered in caves along the shore surrounding the Dead Sea on the western side of the Dead Sea in 1947 and the years after. Most of these texts date from the 1st century BCE, some a little earlier, some a little later. The vast majority of these 900 works are actually in Hebrew, and so they're some of our earliest Hebrew manuscripts or texts. There are some of them which are in Aramaic, and an even smaller percentage of them are in Greek, and an even smaller percentage of them, there's a few texts in Latin from later periods as well. Now, about 25 to 30% of these texts are parts of manuscripts of works which eventually become part of what we would call a Bible today, a modern Bible, regardless of how you order the books. So works like Genesis or Exodus or Isaiah, we found copies of those, or in some cases, fragments of those. And those texts are super important for scholars to understanding the history of the biblical texts. The late, great Dead Sea Scrolls scholar Frank Moore Cross once said that the Dead Sea Scrolls were important because they allowed us to peer behind the veil of the textual history of the Bible. And so when we look through the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can understand and solve questions and problems which had been facing scholarship for well over 150 years by the time the scrolls were discovered. I'll give you one example. So the book of Jeremiah, as we have it, appears in two different versions. So if you look at the Hebrew Bible, we have one version. The other version appears in a older Greek translation of the Bible, known as the Septuagint. Now, the version in the Septuagint is different than the version in the Hebrew Bible. The passages and chapters are in a different order, and it's on a whole, about 1/5 shorter than the version we have in the Hebrew Bible. Before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we were like, how did that happen? Did someone take the Hebrew and when they translate it, cut up and move it around or leave some things out? What was involved there? Lo and behold, when we get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we discover multiple copies of the book of Jeremiah. Not the whole copy of it. We have fragments because, worms and time and age and disintegration. But we have enough there that we can discern that there are different manuscripts of Jeremiah. Some of those manuscripts, and all of them are in Hebrew, some of those manuscripts look a lot like the version we have in our Hebrew Bible. And other versions of them look a lot like what we assume to be the Hebrew underlying the translation that is found in the book of Jeremiah. By having the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can now argue that it wasn't the work of the translator of the Septuagint that changed the text of the Hebrew Bible, but rather in antiquity, there were two recensions or two different versions of the book of Jeremiah that were circulating alongside each other. And in fact, in the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were circulating right next to each other in the same person or group of people's library. So this tells us that the Septuagintal translator, the Greek translator, took one recension and used that as the basis for their translation to Greek of Jeremiah. It seems to be that both of these versions of Jeremiah, they're different, were actually viewed as authoritative by the people who read these texts, which challenges our contemporary notions of thinking about text as fixed objects and you can only use one version of them. A second lesson we learn from the Dead Sea Scrolls as Bible scholars is our notion of there being a fixed canon of Scripture, a fixed list of books which are authoritative for a religious community, and a list of books which are not, is not the same as how people appreciated text in antiquity. They didn't operate with a fixed notion of what a canon was, but they viewed books as authoritative. And often their understanding of what book was authoritative is different than what we might do or might consider today in various religious communities. I'll give you an example. The book of Jubilees is a book that retells the story of Genesis and Exodus, the narrative portions of those two works from the Torah, and it is not in any Western Bibles. It is in the Bible of the Abyssinian Orthodox Church in Ethiopia, and they still read it as Scripture. But most people in the West have never encountered the book of Jubilees. If you go to Qumran and you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls that were collected, we have between 15 and 16, fragments of between 15 and 16 different copies of the Book of Jubilees. When you're thinking about the total number of books that eventually become part of our Bible, that's a pretty significant number. That's more copies of Jubilees circulating among the Dead Sea Scrolls than there were copies of the Book of Leviticus, an equally important book. So this tells us that the folks who had the Dead Sea Scrolls associated with the settlement at Qumran understood these works to be authoritative and important and vital to their religious life. And in fact, in some of their key literature, they quote from and cite and refer to the Book of Jubilees. So these two lessons, one, that there were multiple versions of biblical texts circulating in antiquity, each with equal authority, and that there were different books that people considered important in antiquity than we might today, are two lessons that we've learned about the Bible from studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. No, actually, they didn't really live to be 600 years old. In fact, the Bible tells us in Genesis 25 that Abraham only lived to be 175 years of age, and in Deuteronomy 34 that Moses lived to be 120. And in fact, Moses' age in Judaism becomes the sort of exemplar of how long people can live, up to 120 years of life. And it's in fact a wish for people to have a long life until the 120th year. Now, there are people earlier in the book of Genesis, earlier in the section of the Bible known as the Torah, who do live longer lives. We see in Genesis chapter 5, for instance, it tells us the figure Enoch lived to be 365 years, or the figure Methuselah lived to be 969 years. But by the time we get into Abraham and the other patriarchs, their lives are not quite as long, and they begin to be of a similar length to the length of people's lives today. And as we're seeing that increasingly, people living into their hundreds and oftentimes into their 110s, and some as long as 115 or 116 years of age. So your friend reads the book of Jonah in line with Matthew chapter 12, which talks about the sign of Jonah as a reference to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And certainly within Christianity, since the time of the early Jesus movement, which compiled and wrote the New Testament, they understood Jonah as being a sort of prophetic sign looking forward to the coming of Jesus. But if you only read the text that way, you miss out on a lot, because really what you're only looking at is chapter 2, maybe a little bit where Jonah's in the big fish, what we would call a whale, and a little bit after when he gets out and goes to prophesy against Nineveh. So you're missing large portions of the book. In Judaism, there is a tradition of reading the book of Jonah on the day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, in the afternoon period. And there, the book of Jonah is read as a meditation on repentance, not on a prophecy of a future messianic figure. And there it becomes a place to think about and contemplate what it means to be truly penitent in your relationship with God, to turn towards God, to deepen one's relationship by forsaking past sins and pursuing a path of righteousness. Now, these are two paths, and there are, I think, other ways. And increasingly, scholarship has been looking at the book of Jonah and asking what other ways can this passage, this brief text be read, to think about who we are as people and how we exercise things like moral agency, which is something which I focus on in my own scholarship. How does Jonah understand what it means to be an individual and an individual with obligations in the world? In thinking about ancient texts and ideas, influence is often a hard thing to discern. How do you know that one thing influences the other? What we can say with some confidence is that the story of Noah and the flood and stories about Adam and Eve and other things have other texts from the ancient world that have similar stories to what they have there. Whether or not those other stories directly influence the Bible or they have a shared common tradition, that's a debate within scholars of those texts. Scholars use those other texts, however, to think critically about what exactly is going on in the narratives, the early narratives, the primordial narratives from Genesis 1 through 11. How did these stories evolve? How do they communicate what they're doing? What's distinctive about the Israelite version of these stories versus the version we see in the other ancient Near Eastern texts? And this comparison highlights both similarities as well as differences, and ultimately it highlights its shared features as well as unique aspects of each tradition. Now, for some people, this can be a very challenging idea for them, particularly people who've been brought up on the idea about the uniqueness of the Bible. And for them, it can be a very threatening thing. But for scholars, it's not a threatening thing. It's part and parcel of what we do. We compare and we contrast, and we put the Bible in the context of its historical setting to try to understand it better as a text which people do value today, but which is a unique heritage of one ancient civilization and society. Once again, this is Jonathan Kaplan from the University of Texas at Austin, Department of Middle Eastern Studies, and this has been the Hebrew Bible and Early Judaism Office Hours.